Resurrection of Christ. Did the disciples or the followers of Christ invent it? Resurrection of Christ is the central doctrine or teaching of Christianity since its very beginning. One of the earliest Christian creeds is found in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 and 4. This is what it says, that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he rose again the third day. Jesus was raised, he resurrected, he came back to life. People in the 21st century might shrug off and say, that sounds like a legend, sounds like a story invented by the followers of Christ. The apostles in the early church must have made up the entire story. So in this video, let us consider this line of argument and see whether the apostles could have made up the legend of resurrection. Let us look at 7 arguments and their feasibility. Let's get on with the video. For argument's sake, let's take the apostles made up the story of resurrection. They would have probably done it in a different way than we find in the Bible. Let's go to the first point. Point number 1. The apostles would have made the claim of resurrection far away from where the events took place. If the apostles were trying to make up the story of resurrection, they wouldn't do it in the same place where Jesus was crucified. When someone wants to spread a made-up news, which is not true, they would move to a faraway place from where the actual events took place, and then they would start talking about it. But what actually happened is the opposite. The claims of Christ's resurrection was preached in Jerusalem, the same city where Jesus was crucified a few days earlier, before the same leaders that condemned Jesus to death, before the same people that cheered, crucify him and crucify him. The apostles preached the message that Jesus is alive, and no one could stop them. The Christian apologist, Dr. William Lane Craig, this is what he says about this important point. One of the most amazing facts about the early Christian belief in Jesus' resurrection was that it originated in the very city where Jesus was crucified. The Christian faith did not come to exist in some distant city far from eyewitnesses who knew of Jesus' death and burial. No, it came into being in the very city where Jesus had been publicly crucified under the very eyes of its enemies. The fact that the Christian fellowship, founded on the belief in Jesus' resurrection, could come into existence and flourish in the very city where he was executed and buried seems to be compelling evidence for the historicity of the empty tomb. That's Dr. William Lane Craig. So the location of announcing that Jesus resurrected, it's very important. It tells us the confidence, the conviction of the apostles in the message of resurrection. Let's move on to the second point. If the apostles were trying to make up the story of resurrection, the apostles would have waited for a long time to pass before coming out with the story of a miraculous resurrection. Now, many people assume that the belief in resurrection among Christians evolved over time, perhaps centuries. Now, that's how legends evolve. Legends take time to evolve. It's a gradual process. Slowly, the details gets added up one or the other. But Christianity emerged around the same time of resurrection, not several years later. Jesus was crucified around Passover, and Peter preached his first sermon on the day of Pentecost. So from the Passover to the Pentecost, roughly about 50 days, 7 weeks after resurrection, Jesus was with them for 40 days. And you see, there was literally very little time between resurrection and the first preaching of Peter in front of the Jews in the city of Jerusalem. There was very little time passed. The early Christians, the first believers, believed that Jesus was risen. It's core to their belief. It's core to Christianity from the very beginning. The creed that we read in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, that Christ was buried and he rose according to the scriptures, it could be much earlier. Most of the New Testament researchers and historians, they agree that that creed comes from much earlier times, probably just 5 years after the events of resurrection. Let's go to point number 3. If the apostles were trying to make up the story, the apostles would have claimed that Jesus' resurrection was spiritual, not bodily resurrection. To claim that Jesus rose spiritually would be the best thing if they were trying to make up the story. See, no one could disprove it since it is spiritual resurrection. If they were making it up, that's what the apostles would have done. To claim that Jesus rose again bodily is a falsifiable claim. If anyone wanted to disprove the claim of apostles, they simply had to bring out the body of Christ. But you see, the combined might of the Roman Empire, combined might of all the high priests and the Jewish authorities of that day, they couldn't produce the corpse of Jesus. I'm sure they looked all over the place for the body of Jesus, but they couldn't find it. You know why? Because it was bodily resurrection. Jesus' body, the same body that was beaten, crushed, pierced, and crucified, resurrected back to life in the glorious form. Let's go to the 4th point. The apostles would have carefully chosen very respected witnesses to prove their resurrection story. That is, if they're trying to make up the story of resurrection, that's what they would have done. If the apostles or the disciples of Jesus, if they were making up the story of resurrection, they would have done it very carefully. They would have carefully considered their witnesses. They would have chosen the most important people to be first witnesses that saw the risen Christ. But what do we see in the Gospels? The women saw the risen Christ first. You know that in the 1st century, the testimony of women was not taken that seriously. According to the Jewish book Mishnah, Tractate Shuot 4.1, this is what it says: an oath of evidence applies to men, but not to women. Another tractate, Rosh Hashanah 1.8, this is what it says: these are considered unfit witnesses, gamblers with dice, those who lend interest, pigeon raisers, those who trade in the produce of the sabbatical year, and slaves. This, the general principle, all evidence that a woman is not eligible to give. These people mentioned above, that the gamblers, those who lend money for interest, pigeon raisers, traders of slaves, all of these people are not eligible to bring witnesses. This is to say that the Jewish rabbis did not have a favorable attitude to the testimony of women in the public court, particularly around the time of Jesus, the 1st century. The gospel tells us that Mary Magdalene and other women were the first witnesses of Jesus' resurrection. Think about it. Luke chapter 8, verse 1 to 3. This is what it says. She had been possessed with 7 demons until Jesus cast them out. Mary called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had gone out. So a woman who had been possessed by 7 demons, an indication of the severity of her possession, she was chosen to be the first witness of resurrection. You see, if the disciples were making up the story, they would have certainly avoided these group of women from being the first witnesses, would have avoided these women and chosen more culturally acceptable, dignified, well-known people as the first witnesses of resurrection. Let's go to point number 5. If the apostles, they were trying to make up the story of resurrection, they would not have encouraged investigation or verification of the events. They would have simply said to believe their words. But apostles, on the other hand, they encouraged verification and investigation. Apostle Paul lists several people that were alive that saw the risen Christ. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 5 to 7. That he appeared to Cephas, that is Peter, then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. You see, Paul is listing these people to whom Jesus revealed himself after resurrection. Peter, the 12, 500 people. Some of them are dead, but most of them were alive at the point when Paul was writing this letter. And James, one of the important disciples of the Jerusalem church. So the implication is that if anyone wanted to verify, they are welcome to verify it and investigate it and talk to the people that saw risen Christ. There was nothing to hide. Resurrection was an open truth, and the apostles were transparent about it. And they were so convinced about it, and they did not hide it. They did not hide it from their followers. This is what John Broderick Montgomery, a Christian apologist, says about this aspect of transparency of resurrection. In AD 56, the Apostle Paul wrote that over 500 people had seen the risen Jesus and that most of them were still alive. It passes the bounds of credibility that the early Christians could have manufactured such a tale and then preached it among those who might easily have refuted it by simply producing the body of Jesus. So at this point, you see that they encouraged investigation or verification of the event by presenting the witnesses that were available, that were alive at the time of Paul's writing of the Gospel of Corinthians. Point number 6, the apostles would not have done it without a motivation to gain economic or political or power advantage. When people lie or falsify truth, there are usually certain motivations. That action of lying would mean that it would give them certain advantage, maybe economic, or that would increase their wealth or increase their power. But let's look at the disciples. When Jesus was crucified, they all were so heartbroken. They were completely shattered and they were hiding out. And most of them were from humble background, fishermen from Galilee. They even decided to return to Galilee to pick up their fishing nets again. We don't see secret gathering of the apostles to how to invent the story of resurrection or the legend of resurrection. We don't see any such gathering of the apostles. Also, did the proclamation of resurrection bring apostles wealth and power? No, not at all. On the contrary, the apostles were threatened. The first follower of Christ were threatened, physically assaulted, and even murdered. Apostle Paul gave up his coveted position of power as the Pharisee close to the high priest when he began to preach about resurrection. No economic gain, no power gain. There was no prior motivation to invent the legend of resurrection unless it was based on the historical truth and reality. Point number 7, the apostles would not certainly die for the lie that they made up. Let's say if someone lies under the threat of violence and death, usually people admit their lies, they confess their truth. But in the case of apostles, we see that none of the apostles, they recanted their belief in resurrection. If you look through the history of the early church, as recorded in the book of Acts, every sermon that apostles preached claimed in proclaiming the fact of Jesus' resurrection, whether they preached in Jerusalem or far away from Jerusalem in Asia Minor, in Greece or in Rome, they consistently, without contradiction, proclaimed the fact, the reality, the truth of resurrection. None of them denied the fact of resurrection all through their lives, even at the face of violence and death. All the apostles, the first disciples of Jesus, except John, they faced martyrdom. They died as martyrs without denying the truth of resurrection. They were so convinced in the truth of resurrection. The quote from Lee Strobel, one of the Christian apologists, is quite relevant in this point. People will die for their religious belief if they sincerely believe they are true. But people won't die for their religious beliefs if they know their religious beliefs are false. While most people can only have faith that their beliefs are true, the disciples were in a position to know without a doubt whether or not Jesus had risen from the dead. They claimed that they saw him, talked with him, and ate with him. If they weren't absolutely certain, they wouldn't have allowed themselves to be tortured to death for proclaiming that the resurrection had happened. Let's summarize the 7 points, the 7 arguments that we have seen. If resurrection was a lie invented by the apostles to deceive the followers, they would have made the claim of resurrection far away from where the events actually took place. They would have waited for a long time to pass before spreading the story of resurrection. They would have claimed that Jesus' resurrection was spiritual, not bodily resurrection. They would have carefully chosen very respected witnesses to prove their resurrection story. They would not have encouraged investigation or verification of the events. They would have had secret motivation to gain economic, political, or power advantage. They would not die for the lie that they made up. But what the disciples did was counterintuitive. They preached resurrection in the same place where crucifixion took place, before the same people that crucified Jesus. They started preaching about the resurrection of Jesus in the short while after crucifixion. They claimed that Jesus resurrected bodily, not spiritually. The first witnesses of resurrection were women. They invited investigation and verification and presented 500 eyewitnesses who saw the risen Christ, and most of them were alive at that point when Paul wrote that letter. They didn't have any economic or political or power motivation. In fact, to preach resurrection means to give up power. They were moderate, but never denied their belief in the truth of resurrection. So what actually happened? Was resurrection unexpected? The reality was that no one expected resurrection, particularly the apostles. Though Jesus spoke to them that he would rise again after 3 days, the disciples were planning to go back to their old professions, to their old fishing career in Galilee. The women were busy buying perfumes to anoint the hastily buried body of Jesus, and they were not waiting for resurrection either. But then something totally different happened, totally unexpected. On the morning of the 3rd day, the tomb was found to be empty. Mary Magdalene and other women found out and reported it to the disciples. The disciples, at first, they thought that the Jews opened the tomb and removed the body of Jesus. They didn't still understand that resurrection took place. Such a thought never seems to have crossed their bewildered minds. But it was only afterwards, when Jesus began to appear to them one after another, to Mary Magdalene, to the apostles and the disciples that were going to the village of Emmaus, and then to the apostle Thomas, the reality of resurrection began to sink into their minds. They were filled with joy and with great hope. They were transformed from feeble, weak people that were hiding into bold witnesses of Jesus Christ, proclaiming the power of Jesus' resurrection to all the 4 corners of the earth. Let's close with the 1st century rabbinic test. Gamaliel was a respected Jewish teacher. Now, he was talking to the Sanhedrin. And Sanhedrin was the Jewish council of the elders. And the Jewish council of the elders were discussing about the apostles and how to deal with these men, the disciples of Jesus that were proclaiming Jesus resurrected from the dead. And this is what Gamaliel told them. Acts chapter 5, verses 34 to 39. But a Pharisee named Gamaliel, teacher of the law, who was honored by all the people, stood up in the Sanhedrin and ordered that the men must be put aside for a little while. That is, the apostles. Then he addressed the Sanhedrin. He talked to the Jewish council. Men of Israel, consider carefully what you intend to do to these men, that is, the apostles. Some time ago, Judas appeared, claiming to be somebody, and about 400 men rallied to him. He was killed, and all his followers were dispersed. And it also came to nothing. After him, Judas the Galilean appeared in the days of the census and led a band of people in revolt. He too was killed, and all his followers were scattered. Therefore, in the present case, I advise you, leave these men alone. Let them go. For if their purpose or activity is of human origin, it will fail. But if it is from God, you will not be able to stop these men. You will only find yourself fighting against God. So Gamaliel made some interesting observations from the recent history of the Jewish people. Jesus was not the first person to claim to be the Messiah or the one who came to deliver them from the hand of the Roman oppressors. There were others, Judas the Galilean. In fact, Jerry Rabo, he lists about 50 Jewish messiahs, people who claim to be the deliverers. Judas and Judas the Galilean, they were killed. But what happened to their disciples and followers? They were scattered. The movement was gone. So this is what N.T. Wright, a New Testament scholar, he says, in those days, when the leader of a messianic movement died, there were only two options for the members. Either they choose a new leader and continue their resistance, or disband and join other messianic movements. None of the Jewish messianic movement, past or present, proclaimed that their dead, murdered Messiah came back to life. Let's look at the advice of Gamaliel in the light of what had happened to other similar messianic movements. Leave these men alone. Let them go. For if their purpose or activity is of human origin, it will fail. It will fade away. They will disappear. They will scatter. They will disband. But if it is from God, you will not be able to stop these men. They will become irresistible. You will only find yourself fighting against God. Disciples of Jesus went forth from Jerusalem to every part of the world, carrying the good news of Jesus, the resurrection of Jesus. The gospel transformed pagan cultures, changed the course of civilizations as we know it. That they did not fade away, but they carried the word of the Lord to the nations, to all nations, proclaiming that the risen Christ is the Lord and Savior, not just of the Jewish people, but of the entire world. I would like to close it with a quote from Henry Schaeffer, a scientist and a Christian apologist. If Jesus remained dead, how can he explain the reality of the Christian church and its phenomenal growth in the first 3 centuries of the Christian era? That is, before it got the support of the Roman Empire. Christ's church covered the Western world by the 4th century. A religious movement built on a lie could not have accomplished that. All the power of Rome and that of the religious establishment in Jerusalem was geared to stop the Christian faith. All that they had to do was to dig up the grave and to present the crops, but they didn't. Did Jesus' followers invent resurrection, invent the legend of resurrection? The answer is no. They were proclaiming the truth of resurrection as they felt, as they experienced, and as they lived through. They were eyewitnesses to the life, death, resurrection of Jesus Christ. This is what John says in 1 John chapter 1, verse 1. That which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked at, and our hands have touched, this we proclaim concerning the word of life. We have heard, seen with our eyes, looked at, and our hands have touched. They were first eyewitnesses. They spoke with great conviction in the truth of resurrection. Their conviction to this truth of resurrection that brought the gospel to every part of the world. I would like to present a few books for your reference. The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus by Gary Habermas. It's a very important book. The Resurrection of the Son of God by N.T. Wright. These two are academic books. If you're interested, please consult it, take a look. And Alive by Warner Wallace and The Case for Easter by Lee Strobel. These are very popular books. And if you're interested, please check them out. If you stayed so far, may I request you to subscribe to the channel if you haven't done it already. Also, please let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. May God bless you all.